Use of enemy troops. Part 1. The Ghost Army of the Blue Ridge Camp. Ritchie, nestled in the mist-shrouded mountains of Maryland, was a place that did not exist on any public map. To the few locals who saw the convoys of buses with blacked-out windows winding up the mountain roads, it was simply the intelligence place. But within its heavily guarded perimeter, a unique and desperate alchemy was taking place. Here, the United States Army was building its own Wehrmacht and its own Imperial Japanese Army. The need was born from catastrophic ignorance. Early engagements in North Africa and the Pacific had revealed a painful truth. American troops, for all their courage and material might, did not understand their enemy. They did not know how a German panzer unit deployed for an assault, how a Japanese platoon used the terrain to set an ambush, or what the guttural shouts of an NCO meant. They were fighting phantoms, and phantoms were killing them. Enter the Ritchie Boys. This was the nickname for the first wave of Camp Ritchie's most crucial asset, refugees. They were Jewish academics who had fled Berlin, former officers of the Czechoslovakian army, Austrian socialists, and anti-Nazi Germans. They were men with intimate, often traumatic knowledge of the enemy, now in the uniforms of the U.S. Army. Their task was not just to translate documents, but to become the enemy for the trainees. Professor Emil Vogel, once a lecturer in European history at Heidelberg, now wore the uniform of a U.S. Army captain. His classroom had no desks. It was a patch of woods modeled after the Ardennes. Before him stood a company of wide-eyed lieutenants from Fort Benning. "You are not fighting ideas," Vogel said, his accent still thick, his voice sharp. "You are fighting a machine, a precise, brutal, and adaptable machine. You will now see its gears." He nodded. From the tree line, a bizarre sight emerged. A squad of American soldiers, but outfitted in meticulously reproduced Feldgrau, field gray uniforms, with M1 helmets cleverly modified to resemble German Stahlhelms, carrying Springfield rifles modified to look like Mauser Kar 98Ks. They moved differently lower with a fluid, practiced coordination. Their leader, a sergeant who spoke fluent Pennsylvania Dutch, barked a command in German: "Achtung, Feind im Sicht, Maschinengewehr, Aufstellung." "Attention, enemy in sight, machine gun, set up." The German squad deployed with terrifying speed, the MG team setting up with an economy of motion the Americans had never seen, creating a lethal interlocking field of fire in seconds. The trainees watched, mesmerized and alarmed. This was no longer a cartoon villain from a propaganda poster. This was a clinical, efficient killing unit. Vogel then dissected it. See how the MG-42 is the heart? Everything protects it. The riflemen are its eyes and its shield. They do not think as individuals, they think as a single organism. To defeat it, you must blind it, then dismember it. A head-on assault is a gift to them. They will calculate the range and cut you down. The training escalated. They built full-scale mock German defensive positions. Zigzag trenches, concrete pillboxes made of timber and plaster, and deadly killing zones pre-sited for mortars. The enemy troops, often German Americans from the Midwest who had grown up speaking the language at home, lived, ate, and drilled according to German field manuals. They learned German drill commands, sang German marching songs, and studied the tactics of Rommel and Manstein. For weeks at a time, they were the 5th Panzer Division or the 1st SS Leibstandarte. For the American units rotated through Ritchie for opposing force, OPFOR training, it was a shock therapy. One lieutenant, Bill Anderson from Kansas, led his platoon in a night exercise against the Germans. They were caught in a pre-registered mortar barrage, using flash simulators and thunder flashes, then assaulted by a squad using the classic German Hutier infiltration tactics. Small groups silently penetrating their lines to cause chaos from within. Anderson's platoon was annihilated in 20 minutes. Humiliated and angry, he was debriefed by a Ritchie boy, a former Czech officer who had fought the Germans in 1938. "They did not outfight you," the Czech said calmly. They outthought you. You assumed they would defend. They attacked. You must never assume. By 1943, the graduates of Camp Ritchie and its sister sites were fanning out across the U.S. training landscape. They established permanent OP-4 units at massive maneuver grounds like the Louisiana maneuvers. Here, entire divisions clashed in war games, with the German battalions, equipped with tanks painted with Balkan crosses, executing complex delaying actions and counterattacks that baffled American commanders. The cost was astronomical millions of dollars for uniforms, equipment, and lost training time, and the brass often grumbled about the expense. But the men who survived the hell of the Blue Ridge and the Louisiana Panzers carried something invaluable to the shores of Normandy and the hills of Italy. Not just knowledge, but respect. They had faced the ghost and knew its face. Part 2. The Sun God's Warriors in the Smokies. If the European enemy was a precise machine, the Pacific enemy was a terrifying phantom, a shapeshifter who emerged from the very earth and jungle. To prepare for this, the Army looked west, to the vast, rugged terrain of California and the deep, misty valleys of the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. Here, they would build Little Tokyo in the wilderness. The challenge was even greater. Few Japanese Americans had military expertise, and those who were willing to serve were often under suspicion themselves. The solution was twofold. Utilize the incredible linguistic and cultural knowledge of the Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, in a different, secretive capacity, and create an OP-4 unit from scratch using dedicated American troops. At Camp Savage and later Fort Snelling in Minnesota, the Military Intelligence Service, MIS, was conducting its own miracle, training Nisei soldiers like George Joe Sakato to be interpreters and interrogators. But for tactical training, the Army needed a physical opponent. They found it in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, but not as one might expect. While the famed 442nd would go on to fight with legendary bravery in Europe, in their early training, some of their companies were temporarily seconded to a unique, clandestine role. Meanwhile, at Camp Polk in Louisiana and in the hills around Fort Knox, a dedicated Japanese battalion was formed. They were mostly volunteers, men fascinated by the challenge or driven by a desire to understand the most alien enemy America had ever faced. Their commander was Major John Jack Leland, an eccentric, brilliant officer who had been a language officer in Tokyo before the war. He immersed his men in a total immersion course in Japanese militarism. Their training camp was surreal. American GIs rose at dawn to face east and bow, practicing emperor worship drills. They learned to eat with chopsticks, studied Bushido code, and drilled with an almost fanatical intensity, mimicking the Japanese emphasis on spiritual power over material. They learned to scream banzai with authentic fervor and to conduct silent night movements, their faces sometimes smeared with mud. They practiced building intricate, concealed bunker systems and laying ambushes along jungle trails. The crucible for this knowledge was the Tennessee maneuvers. In the dense green hills of the Smokies, which bore an uncanny resemblance to the terrain of Burma and New Georgia, entire American regiments would be thrown into weeks-long exercises against Leland's samurai. For the Green troops, it was a terrifying and confusing ordeal. Private First Class Danny O'Malley from Boston, part of the 33rd Infantry Division, experienced it during the summer of '43. His company was ordered to clear a ridge held by the OP-4. They advanced cautiously, seeing nothing. Suddenly, from invisible spider holes and camouflaged logs, blank gunfire erupted. Men were killed by opponents they never saw. Then, as they were pinned down, a swarm of screaming Japanese soldiers, some wielding wooden mock-ups of Arisaka rifles with fixed bayonets, charged their position in a frenzied banzai attack. The shock was physical. Danny froze, his training deserting him. A hand grabbed his shoulder. It was his platoon sergeant, a veteran of the earlier disastrous battles on Guadalcanal. "Now you see, O'Malley," the sergeant yelled over the din. "They don't fight to live. They fight to make you die with them. You don't stand and trade shots. You lay down a wall of fire and cut them down before they get close." The after-action review was brutal. Major Leland, now out of his Japanese commander role, lectured the shattered company. He showed them the hidden bunkers, some with tunnels connecting them. He explained the logic of the Banzai charge, not a tactic of victory, but of maximum psychological shock and chaos when a position was doomed. "Your fire discipline is your life," Leland intoned. "One machine gun, properly sighted, can stop 100 charging men, but you must not break. If you break, they will be among you with bayonets, and in the jungle, there is no running." Danny O'Malley and thousands like him learned hard lessons in the Tennessee fog that would save them in the Philippine jungles and on Okinawan ridges. They learned to expect the invisible enemy, to fortify their perimeters against night infiltration, to kill the momentum of a charge with overwhelming disciplined fire. They learned that the enemy was not fanatical in a stupid way, but bound by a code that made him predictable in his tactics of sacrifice and surprise. The Afor, screaming in practiced Japanese and emerging from the American soil like ghosts, had made the unimaginable familiar, and in doing so, stripped it of some of its terror. Part 3. The Echo in the Real War. The ultimate test of the multi-million-dollar ghost armies came not on the maneuver grounds of America, but in the shattered towns of Europe and the lethal jungles of the Pacific. The soldiers who had faced the doppelgangers carried the experience with them like a hidden shield. For Lieutenant Bill Anderson, the Kansas farm boy killed at Camp Ritchie, his moment came in the Hurtgen Forest. His company was advancing along a fire break when they began taking devastating, accurate mortar fire. The shells walked down the column with horrific precision. The old, cold feeling from the Maryland woods returned. This was a pre-registered killing zone. He remembered Professor Vogel's voice. "They do not waste ammunition. If the mortars are falling, they are hurting you or pinning you for the machine guns." Instead of ordering a frantic rush forward or back, Anderson forced his men into the thick marginal cover at the forest edge, away from the cleared fire break. He sent scouts crawling along the flanks. As he suspected, they found a well-camouflaged German MG-42 nest, waiting to slaughter anyone who tried to flee down the open lane. They flanked and eliminated it with a grenade. The mortar fire, now blind, ceased. Anderson had recognized the pattern because he had been its victim before in a training exercise. The ghost of Camp Ritchie had just saved 30 lives. In the Pacific, Danny O'Malley's unit landed on a rocky, unnamed island off the coast of New Guinea. As they moved inland, the terrain dense, wet, and eerily quiet triggered a deep-seated memory of the Smokies. He found himself scanning not for soldiers, but for irregularities. A vine line that was too straight, a mound of earth that seemed out of place. He pointed out a suspicious patch of ferns to his squad leader. The sergeant dismissed it. Minutes later, a lethal burst of fire from that exact position killed the point man. From then on, O'Malley's squad listened to him. He anticipated the flanking movements, insisted on checking every spider hole with a grenade before passing, and when the inevitable screaming Banzai charge came on their third night, his squad was ready. They had pre-sighted their automatic weapons on the likely approaches and laid out grenades. They didn't break. They held their line and cut down the charging shadows in a storm of fire. The tactic was brutal, but it was the tactic Major Leland had drilled into them. The Phantom of Tennessee had been exercised by the reality of preparation. The use of enemy troops had a profound secondary effect. It humanized the adversary. The Ritchie boys and the Nisei instructors didn't just teach tactics. They explained why the enemy fought that way. The German emphasis on decentralization and mission command, Auftragstaktik. Tactic. The Japanese cultural imperative for sacrifice and honor. This was not to create sympathy on the battlefield, but to create understanding. A soldier who understands his opponent's motivations is less likely to be surprised, less likely to make catastrophic assumptions. After the war, the mock enemy programs were scaled back, but their DNA was woven into the fabric of the modern U.S. military. The concept of a dedicated professional opposing force, OPFOR, became permanent. The National Training Center at Fort Irwin, established in the 1980s, is home to the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, which permanently plays the role of a Soviet-style force, complete with T-72 tanks, simulated with modified U.S. vehicles, and Warsaw-packed tactics. At the Joint Readiness Training Center in Louisiana, the OP-4 specializes in irregular warfare, mimicking insurgent and guerrilla forces. The refugee experts, the Nisei, and the thousands of Americans who spent the war pretending to be the enemy performed a vital, unsung service. They were the nation's sparring partners, the ones who landed the painful practice blows that taught the body how to absorb a real hit. The staggering cost in dollars, time, and effort paled in comparison to the return on investment measured in lives saved on 1,000 bloody beaches and in 1,000 dark forests. They proved that in war, the most dangerous enemy is the unknown, and the most valuable weapon is sometimes the mirror, held up in time to show an army not just its own face, but the face of the foe it must learn to defeat.